Hello, today I'm going to be doing a quick presentation on a few manuscript genres in the Middle Ages. There are four genres of manuscripts I'll be discussing here: the bestiary and the Book of Hours, as well as maps and music that appeared in them. I'd like to start out by discussing the bestiary, which was a book that was quite common during the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, the world was very focused on religion and religious teachings. Individuals needed to be well-versed in the teachings of Christ and the Church in order to lead a proper life and ensure a peaceful transition into the afterlife. These teachings were often found in liturgical texts, which was fine for those who could attend church or could read. Unfortunately, the literacy rate in the Middle Ages was incredibly low, so very few people actually had access to these things. One way to help remedy this was to make the lessons more relatable to the lay person. The characteristics of the animals were used to create allegorical stories that conveyed a lesson, much like a fable. These lessons were all contained within the Book of Beasts, known as a bestiary. Because animals were a very large part of life for a lot of society due to the high population of farmers, these stories were a bit easier to comprehend than those directly from liturgical texts. The beasts. According to Isidore of Seville, a beast was an animal which ferociously attacked either with its mouth or claws. Beasts were characteristically wild, enjoyed natural freedom, and were driven by their own desires. These characteristics were often fairly apparent in the manner the animals were drawn. Some of the most common real animals were those of the feline and canine family: lions, cats, dogs, hyenas, as well as reptiles such as the alligator. Popular mythological beasts that appeared were the centaur, the unicorn, the phoenix, and the dragon. The first example of a bestiary I wanted to mention is the Northumberland bestiary. This was written in the 13th century. It's about 75 pages long and contains 112 images. The folio you see here depicts Adam naming each of the animals. The artist took great care to include as many animals as possible, leaving little room for any decoration short of a decorative green border. Here's another example of a 12th century English bestiary. This falls into what is considered the second family of bestiaries. This image here shows a knight spearing a unicorn whose head is in the lap of a virgin. This image uses a large amount of gold leaf as a backdrop to vivid ink painting. In this image from the Rochester bestiary, you can see an elephant carrying armed riders toward a group of armed men on horseback. It was believed that soldiers rode elephants into battle in India carrying castles on their backs. In the lower half of the image, you can see several animals that look to be warthogs grazing. This bestiary also dates to around the 13th century. Books of Hours were created as a type of offshoot of the monk's prayer book or breviary. These were intended for those who are not ordained. They contain various sets of hours, including the Hours of the Virgin, Hours of the Holy Cross, Hours of the Passion, as well as the Suffrages of the Saints and the Office of the Dead, which I'll discuss in just a moment. These were most popular during the 14th through 16th centuries in Northern Europe and were very often given as gifts. Initially, books of hours were more popular and accessible to those of high birth, but as literacy increased across Europe, so did the popularity of the individual prayer book. These books had prayers and other liturgical elements that were to be read during the canonical hours of the day. The Hours of the Virgin, Hours of the Passion, Suffrages of the Saints, and Office of the Dead were a few elements that would appear in these books. Their customizable nature also contributed to their popularity. The buyer could choose which and how many elements to include, such as specific gospels, suffrages of certain saints, and calendars. They could also dictate what type of illuminations to include: simple line drawings with little in the way of decoration, or more extravagant images with gold leaf and images painted with vibrant colors. These books were typically designed for specific regions. For example, you might have a Book of Hours designed for the use of Rome. This would include saints and calendar events that were specific to the Roman region. Likewise, there were books of hours designed for the use of France, as well as the use of Sarum, which was the Salisbury region of England. The Hours of the Virgin were a series of prayers and praise for the Virgin Mary. There were 8 canonical hours during which prayers were recited. They were Matins, Lauds, Prime, Terce, Sext, None, Vespers, and Compline. These were set throughout the day and were generally accompanied by images that coincided with each hour. These images were fairly standard across the genre of books, with the exception of Vespers, which could vary from one to the next. This image, taken from the Book of Hours of Jean of France, dates to the 15th century. It accompanies the Hour of Lauds, which falls in the morning. This comes from the Hours of the Virgin in this book. The book here is quite elaborate. The illustrations are very vivid. It has a lot of historiated initials, and the marginalia or illumination in the margins is incredibly complex. Great care was taken to create detailed scroll work that accentuates the image within. This type of illumination indicates that the book belonged to a member with high societal status, which this gentleman was. The Office of the Dead was another section of the Book of Hours that would vary from place to place. It was not present in all books of hours, but when it was, it could be found at the back of the book. It was read during the hours of matins and vespers during funerary services. The reader would pray repeatedly throughout the lessons for pity and mercy upon death for the deceased. This page from the Office of the Dead also comes from John of France's Book of Hours. Like the other image from his book, it is very vibrant and complex. However, this illustration is much more graphic in nature. Two corpses lie in an open grave below two individuals reading above them. The marginalia on this page matches that of the previous page, contrasting significantly from the image itself. Another section in the Books of Hours was the Suffrages of the Saints. Suffrages were a series of prayers to specific saints. Each book would contain a list of saints that the reader would pray to, each of which would have been chosen by the person purchasing the book. The saints included would vary from person to person and place to place. This page is taken from the Suffrages of the Saints portion of the Book of Hours for Jeanne d'Evreux, who was the Queen of France in the 14th century. The saint depicted here is St. Louis, a canonized saint who was a former king of France. The colors in this book are not quite as vivid as the previous examples, but the drawings and historiated initials are still incredibly detailed. The next genre I'd like to discuss are medieval maps. These would frequently appear in other manuscripts that were created during this time period. Back in the Middle Ages, the world looked quite different than it does today. The compass as we know it was a bit skewed. Directional east sat at the top of the map of the world, placing Asia at today's north, with Europe and Africa at today's southwest and southeast, respectively. These were the only known map lands at the time, and the city of Jerusalem would typically sit at the center of the map, as it was believed to be the center of the world. There are three different categories of maps that came out of the Middle Ages: the Mappa Mundi, or Map of the World, Portolan charts, and Ptolemaic maps. The first category of maps was the Mappa Mundi, which had four subcategories. Zonal maps were maps of the Eastern Hemisphere that showed 5 different climate zones, only 2 of which were habitable. TO maps showed only the habitable portions of the world during the Middle Ages, and were arranged in such a way that the letter T appeared to split the map into 3 sections. Quadripartite maps showed the 3 known continents, with an ocean separating them from a 4th unknown one. Complex maps were the most common and were very detailed. These maps showed cities, towns, waterways, historical figures, etc., and we'll get to take a look at one of these in just a moment. Portolan charts. The word portolan comes from the Italian word portolano, which means related to ports or harbors, or a collection of sailing directions. These were first produced in the 13th century in Italy, and later on they were also produced in Spain and Portugal. These were based on accounts of sailors who'd sailed the Mediterranean and Black Seas, and were noted particularly for their navigational accuracy. There were 3 classifications of portolan charts: Italian, which encompassed modern Western Europe and the Mediterranean; Catalan, which came from a region in Spain, were geographical maps; and Portuguese charts superimposed the equatorial and tropical lines over the lands and oceans. Ptolemaic maps were world maps dating to the 2nd century AD that were based on the work of Ptolemy, who was, among other things, a geographer and astronomer. These maps were the first to display lines of latitude and longitude, as well as terrestrial descriptions based on celestial observations. The first example of medieval maps that I wanted to discuss is a pretty interesting one. The Vinland map is a world map, or Mappa Mundi, that appears to show the North American eastern seaboard approximately half a century before Columbus arrived. This was considered nearly irrefutable proof that the Vikings were the true discoverers of what came to be known as the New World. However, after several decades of investigation, it was determined that the map was almost definitely a forgery. This was due to inconsistencies in the dating of the ink, as well as wormholes that didn't quite match up with the manuscript when it was found, among other things. Here's an image of the Vinland map. As you can see, it looks quite similar to our modern world maps. In the upper left corner, you can see Greenland with portions of the eastern seaboard beneath it. You can see why this map would be considered of great historical importance if, in fact, it turned out to be legitimate. The Psalter map is a world map that depicts the world as viewed by a 13th century church. It's a round disc with Eden, or East, sitting at the top, beneath the image of Jesus. Along the border are creatures symbolizing the unknown lands outside the known regions of the world. To the right here, you can see the entire Psalter map, and to the left are two close-ups. At the top is an image of Jesus. The significance of this is that it depicts how central he was to the beliefs of the time period. He's not only standing on top of the world, a phrase that we use to describe incredible happiness today, he's also holding the world, that little sphere you see there with a T in the center, representing a TO map, in his hand. Another phrase that's also quite common today. On the lower left-hand side is a close-up of some quite strange-looking creatures. These represent the uncertainty of what lay outside the borders of the known lands at the time. The Carta Marina is the earliest known map of the Nordic or Northern European countries. It was created in the mid-16th century in Rome and took approximately 12 years to complete. It's an incredibly complex map containing place names, cartographic lines, and rich illustrations. Here you can see just how detailed the Carta Marina was. On the right-hand side is a close-up view of Scandia. There are trees, animals, mountains, coats of arms, and place names taking up nearly every free space. I've tried to zoom in as much as possible, but it's still a bit difficult to truly grasp the complexity of the map. Just by looking at it, though, you can get a pretty good idea of why it took more than a decade to complete. Now I'd like to talk a bit about music in the Middle Ages. One thing to note about musical composition is that notation didn't become standardized until around the 12th century. This meant that you might find one form of notation in a liturgical book from England and another form in a book from Rome. As standardization spread, it became easier to compose music, and this included for the lay people. Secular music began to increase in popularity. These songs would include tavern songs, love songs, and songs of conquest and war. These secular songs were written and performed by troubadours for both religious and lay audiences. As I mentioned, musical notation did not become standardized until the 12th century. The markings used back then were called neumes and would equate to our modern musical notes. These began as an accent placed above the lyrics in a text and were used to help guide the melody of a piece. These were normally in the form of a punctus or small dot above the words. In the 11th century, markings for pitch were also added. These were introduced by Ademar de Charbon and would appear as small dots at varying heights above the text. Lined musical notation was introduced around the same time as notation for pitch. The punctus was replaced with the nota quadrata and ligatures which connected notes. Following on the heels of this were notation for rhythm. These included the breve or single note, the long note, the double long or maxima, and the semi-breve. If you take a look at the image here, you can see just how similar it was to our modern sheet music. Music was often included in liturgical texts and other manuscripts in the Middle Ages. Up until the 15th century, the text of a manuscript was written first, leaving blank space for music to be filled in. It was then handed off to the person writing in the musical notation. Illuminations and decorations were typically added last. Later, in some manuscripts, the music was written first, followed by text and illuminations. Here are a couple of examples of music in medieval manuscripts. On the left is Sume is Ecumen in, which is one of the oldest known scores written in English. It's in Middle English, so we likely wouldn't be able to understand much of it if we read it, but at the time this was considered English. On the right-hand side is a more elaborate page from another manuscript. In this case, it appears that the historiated initial was put in first. If you look at the tip of the arrow, you can see that some of the black ink of the top note appears to be on top of the gold leaf. This, of course, could also mean that someone went in and corrected a portion of the note that was covered up by the initial, but there's really no way to be certain of that. Musical instruments, there were four main categories in the Middle Ages. The most common was the human voice. The other three were wind, strings, and keyboards. Here are a couple of examples of medieval musical instruments. On the left is the gemshorn, a type of wind instrument. In the center is the rebec, a bowed-stringed instrument. And last is the psaltery, a stringed instrument that was played with one's fingers, similar to a harp. I hope you enjoyed this presentation. Feel free to take a look at the supplemental links provided on my website to further explore the topics discussed here. Thank you.